introduction. So welcome everybody and to this In the Vineyard with session. Gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Caroline Gilby, Master of Wine. So a little bit about Caroline first. So after a degree in botany and another one in horticulture, Caroline changed tracks and joined Augustus Barnett in 1988 as a trainee buyer. Caroline is a Master of Wine since 1992. And since 1995, she's working as an independent consultant and a freelance wine writer, contributing regularly to Decanter, Harper's, Ravia, Vino, and many more publications. And as I discovered at 5 o'clock this afternoon, JancesRobinson.com, I discovered a 4,300 word article about Bulgarian wine. And when I sort of complained to her that I could have done with reading it earlier, she said, well, it was only published yesterday. She writes for Hugh Johnson's Pocket Wine Book, the Oxford Companion to Wine, World Atlas of Wine, the Wine Opus, Wine Reporter, and Wines of the World. She's a panel judge at Decanter's World Wine Awards, responsible for Hungary since 2011, and later added under her responsibilities the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. She judges wine regularly in Eastern Europe, and in 2018, she published this lovely book, which covers the 3 countries we're talking about today. And you will have a great opportunity later on to hear about how you can buy today or the next few days with a special code at an incredible discount. A fantastic book. So yeah, so after that long introduction, welcome Caroline.
Hi.
Hi. So okay, so Caroline, the first question that comes to my mind is, okay, it's the late 80s, you got into the wine trade, the Berlin Wall is falling, and you're deciding to fall in love with Eastern European wine. Why?
Well, I shall just bring up my screen because this is kind of, if I can get it to work, this is kind of where I started. So you've done that bit. So very early in my, so when I joined Augustus Barnett as junior buyer, I was given Eastern Europe as my first buying responsibility because frankly it wasn't very glamorous at that point, you know, and the more senior members of the buying team all wanted, you know, Burgundy and Champagne and you name it. So and at that point Bulgaria was absolutely massive in the UK. You know, it was the 4th biggest supplier of red wine into the UK market. You know, we drank absolutely gallons of the stuff back then. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of cases. It was huge. So I cut my teeth as a junior buyer with, can you see my presentation? I should have
Yes, we see it, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, these were some of the scenes that, you know, so some of my friends that are winemakers and so on will have lived through this. But so I kind of got very involved in Bulgaria first, and then later on, obviously, Romania came along. I was buying a lot of wine from Yugoslavia to Lutemalaski Riesling and wines that are from some red wines from today's Serbia, and so on and so on. So I kind of got very involved as a buyer in those days. And then I stopped being a buyer and I forgot about it to some extent. But I should just show you this. So this is the exam paper from the year that I passed the tasting. So I passed the theory in 91 and then had the tasting still to get in 92. And if you see here, there were 3 red wines from Bulgaria in the MW exam in 1992. Now that is absolutely unthinkable today, but I think it illustrates the point of really how important Bulgaria was in the UK market at that point, including a Mavrud, a Merlot and a Cabernet Sauvignon. So, you know, Bulgarian Cab was what many of us as older people in the conversation will have grown up drinking. But yeah, and then, you know, for lots of good reasons, which I could talk about for an hour on its own, Bulgaria disappeared pretty much very, very rapidly in the mid-90s, in the face of issues with how they privatized their industry. And of course, it was about the time the New World was starting its rise and kind of doing what Bulgaria used to do, you know, soft, fruity, reliable, varietally labeled wines. And kind of Australia came along and did what Bulgaria had been doing at a time when Bulgaria was struggling with quality and so on. So after that, I kind of, when I left buying, I moved into doing various bits of consultancy and had in mind that I might do some writing at some point. And I was approached by Tom Stevenson in the early 2000s, who was starting a new book called The Wine Report, and asked whether I'd like to write for it. So, of course, I jumped at the opportunity. And the more I got involved in Eastern Europe, the more it snowballed, really, because the more I realised that not only had I been seeing the end of the old era and the beginning of the new era, so I knew where they came from, but it's been so dynamic. It's been a complete revolution from there to here. Not just, you know, if I'd chosen, I don't know, Italy or Burgundy or Spain, there might have been a little bit of evolution. But, you know, there to here in these countries in Eastern Europe has been so dramatic. And it's still happening. Every time I go back, it's just new producers, people getting better at understanding their native grape varieties and so on and so on. So, yeah, that's how I fell in love with the place. And I feel we've kind of grown up together in the new era of wine.
Okay. I just wanted to let you, because I'm you ready there with the I'm to orientate us. So I'll let you move on before I ask another question. Yes. So.
Yeah, well, I always think it's a good idea to just remind people where the countries that I'm talking about are. So this is pretty much my patch, though I do touch on also some of the other former Soviet republics like Armenia, and also touch on Cyprus and Turkey, which are not, you know, weren't communist, but they'd have gone through some of the same issues of going through collectivized mass market to individual private producers. So it's a pretty big part of the wine world, and one that I think we don't know enough about in the UK, certainly, and maybe some other countries in Western Europe. I think we're quite good at seeing it all. We were quite good at seeing it all as a sort of homogenous, grey, Soviet, concrete, Eastern European mass that was all the same. But actually these countries, and when I started to write the book, I thought that actually there would be more shared history than there is. So basically I ended up writing 3 books in one, because even though these 3 countries that I wrote about in my book are so, you know, so close to each other, they're also very, very different in the ways that they evolved before communism and the ways that they evolved after communism. So, yeah, so those are the 3 countries. Did you have a question then, Moshe? Or shall I carry on? Everybody's gone silent. I don't know about you. I can't hear you.
Oh, yes. Now can you hear me? Yes.
I've got you now. Yes.
I'm here now. So the question that I wanted to ask about is to go back in history, pre-communism. So evidence for winemaking and quality of winemaking, if you can just guide us through. We hear now a little bit about Cotnar, Romania, but what is the history before communism?
Well, it's quite a long and complex story, but vineyards and wine, you know, quality of wine has been admired in all these three countries for a very, very long time. And we're going back to, you know, ancient Thrace, the legend of Dionysius, the god of wine. Both Romania and Bulgaria like to claim the origin of the original birthplace of the god of wine, which tells you that they've had long connections with wine. You know, in Bulgaria, they've found amazing, you know, treasures that include cups for wine drinking. You know, the richest ancient gold treasure ever found was in Bulgaria, with like 7 kilos of gold dug up in a field near Panegyriska. And it's quite stunning, and it's clear that wine was a very important, very significant ceremonial product. And then there are tales of, you know, in the early days of the Bulgarian regime, before, as Bulgaria was set up, you know, there are stories about one of the Khans talking to his sons and giving them a bundle of grape twigs to break, and they couldn't break it. And then he's on his deathbed and he takes each twig by itself, and it can break. So the point he was trying to make was that there was strength in sticking together. But, you know, grapevines are cropping up in these stories all the time in these countries. You know, there's evidence of historic fossilized grapes going back many millennia in Moldova, for instance. So long history. And of course, you mentioned Kotnar. Obviously, Kotnar at one time was, you know, drunk and feted in the royal courts across Europe, and was probably even more highly regarded than Tokaj at one time. And this was an era where, I suppose, sugar wasn't readily available, so sweet things were very much admired, and Kotnar, the sweet wines of Kotnar were up there, and so on. But I think there's an interesting comparison with how Tokaj has kind of come out of the communist era and how Kotnar has, because Tokaj, obviously global reputation for its sweet wines, lots of foreign investment, lots of small wineries, lots of evolution in terms of wine styles through, you know, sparkling wines, late harvest wines, new era of Zamorodny, and of course the dry wines that are very much the fore in Tokaj. Whereas Kotnar is very successful in the domestic market, and there are basically only 2 producers. There's the former state company, and then an offshoot that the former privatized state company has also set up to be a more premium operation. But basically the whole appellation of Kotnar is owned by these 2 companies.
Okay, so and then obviously there was the communist era, and we all sort of get the idea that there was a lot of industrialization, and countries like Moldova were harnessed to make wine for the Soviet Union, and pretty much all traces of previous traditions were almost erased. But again, in 1989, 1990, and the early 90s, countries started to emerge. Do you think that all 3 countries emerged equally or in the same fashion out of communism?
No, I think they emerged quite differently, and each country had a different political way of privatizing and doing their land restitution. So Bulgaria tried to give everything back to the people, the families of the people that had owned it prior to 1945, and it took them at least 12 years. And to be honest, it's not even now still not completely resolved, but you can imagine the, you know, tracking down the paperwork and then getting all the representatives of the descendants of those of individual owners in front of an attorney for wineries to buy the land, for instance, has just been a complete bureaucratic nightmare. And then you had issues with arguments over, okay, so if there were grapevines on it, but the grapevines didn't belong to the people that had owned the land before World War II. So, you know, a lot of grapevines got pulled out or burned because it was easier to sort of sort out empty land than land that had crops on it. So it was a very complicated process. Romania went through a slightly different process of privatization through vouchers. And Moldova went through a different process again of privatizing by sharing out the state farms, the kokholzes and sovkhozes, and dividing everything up equally between the workers for those operations. So people ended up with a little bit of vineyard, a little bit of maybe cornfield, a little bit of forest. So that caused its own problems in very many ways. So again, a big and complicated subject, but I think in summary, what happened in all three countries is you ended up with a lot of fragmentation of land holdings and land being owned by people who weren't necessarily grape growers or vineyard owners or specialists. And that's part of the reason why sort of quality fell through the floor for quite a long time. And it became clear, I think, by the sort of early to mid 2000s to wineries that actually the only way they were going to get the quality of fruit they needed was to start owning vineyards. But then you had this very complicated bureaucratic process of having to find the hundreds of owners. You know, I remember one winery telling me to put together 200 hectares. They had to have contracts with 600 owners.
Wow.
So, yeah. You know, so there are lots of stories like this, and then there are a number of stories of people trying to get their own get their own land back. So can you see my screen again now?
You can share again, yes.
Yeah.
I just needed to keep an eye on questions, so I moved back.
Okay.
But
yes, Kathy, I have noted your comment, and I will get on to some of the numbers in a little bit. So can you see my screen now?
No, you need to do the share again.
I don't know how to do that. Hang on, let's see if I do that. Okay, share screen. Right, let's try this again. Are we working now? Okay.
Yes.
Right, so I'll just tell you a little bit about Romania. Okay, big country. You've got the Carpathian Mountains that form this horseshoe through the country. Population sort of nearly 21 million, so it's the biggest of these three countries. And just about every corner of Romania, apart from probably the high peaks of the mountains, there are vineyards. And it's divided up into these 8 regions. And then within that, there are something approximately 33 PDO regions, but some of those have multiple styles. So there's quite a long list, and they are in some use in the country. So I'll just point out a couple of interesting regions. I'm sure some of you will have come across the wines of Cremele Recaș, and that's over here. So this area of the sort of this area of the country was Austro-Hungarian Empire at one point, and these areas were the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. So these parts of the country, the Republic of Moldova and what are called the Moldovan Hills today over in the northwest corner, have a lot of shared history, particularly. So the country didn't come together as the country we know it with these 3 regions together really till 1918. So from that point of view, it's Romania as we see it today is a relatively young country. So you've got a bit of Black Sea coast, and of course you've got the Danube to the south of the country, and you know, Ukraine to the north, Moldova over here, and so on. That's fairly self-explanatory. So let's do a few key statistics, mainly because I like numbers, but it gives you a perspective, I think, on the relative sizes of the industry. So Romania likes to talk a lot about how it has, you know, 182,000 hectares of vineyards, which makes it the 5th biggest grower of grapes in Europe and the 6th biggest in wine production. But hidden in that is this problem of the fact that the vineyard area of Vitis vinifera is somewhat less than 100,000 hectares. So it's still a very big, significant wine country, but the bit that we're interested in, that the bit that could make quality commercial wine, is less than 100,000 hectares. Yeah, so I think, and it's a little bit more white wine than red wine. DOCG wines are quite widely used. I say commercial wine production, just under 3.5 million hectolitres in 2018 of Vitis vinifera. It's an interesting country in that it's a couple of things. I mean, it was different to the other two countries in that, you know, it wasn't part of Comecom. So most of the wine production during the communist era was destined for the domestic market rather than for export, which I think has a lot to do with the fact that Romania kept significant areas of its indigenous grape varieties, or at least some of the more prolific ones, like the Fatasca family and so on. Whereas Bulgaria, because it was designated for export, you know, it became very strongly orientated towards Cabernet and Merlot and Chardonnay and so on. And Moldova itself, of course, was part of the Soviet Union, so that's a different pattern again. So Romania is also, I say, it's a big country with a big population, and it's been a net importer of wine since 2006. So most of its wine is drunk in Romania. And that, I think, has quite big implications for the drive to improve quality, because a lot of the market is quite unsophisticated. There's still quite a lot of semi-sweet, dry, semi-sweet white and red wines being drunk. So, and it's very heavily dominated by sort of 4 or 5 big players as well. And it is changing. People are moving towards dry wines, but for a long time, the big producers haven't really had to change what they do in terms of quality. So quality evolution has been driven by the smaller and mid-sized producers. Raycash, of course, has become one of the big producers, even though they weren't before. So, and then just to tell you a little bit about the leading grape varieties. The two Fatasca, white Fatascas, the Royal Fatasca Regala and Fatasca Alba, are both very significant. Merlot, the most planted red grape variety, which might come as a surprise to you. Riesling Italico, Grashevina, whatever, usually labelled just Riesling in Romania. And then down here, you know, of the native grape varieties, I think the two white ones, the Fatasca Alba and Regala, both have some good potential for quality. Fatasca Niagara probably is most people's favourite as the potential flagship red. So that's the black maiden grape. Barbesca Niagara, which is the black old grandmother's grape, is also known as Rara Niagara in Moldova, and I'll talk about that a bit later because it does its best in Moldova rather than in Romania. And then what you might, did I put the next slide? No, I didn't. Oh yes, and a number you might find quite interesting is Pinot Noir. That's a 2017 figure because the 2018 figures didn't show it, but Pinot Noir is what Romania is famous for. And, you know, there's not that much of it. Pinot Gris, even less. And those are the two really, really big things that Romania would be known for in the UK market.
Caroline, am I right to remember from 2 decades ago that most of the Pinot Noir came from actually near the Black Sea, and made, quite few were made as semi-sweet and even sweet, and there's a whole stack, and it's a hot region. It's they selected a really hot region to plant quite a bit of the Pinot Noir. Am I right?
Yes, quite a lot of it did come from that region, and sort of semi-sweet wines, Chardonnays, Pinot Gris, and so on were really quite famous from that region, particularly under a winery called Mofatlar, which has disappeared after a massive VAT scandal a couple of years ago. So, you know, it's a complex country, but Pinot Noir plantings have grown. But interestingly, it's a really difficult grape to sell in the domestic market because people still there associate quality in red wines with deep colour. So actually producers find Pinot Noir quite hard to sell in the domestic market. So which is
any highlighting of the characteristics of the other varieties that we might never see outside Romania?
Yeah, well, one or two interesting small grape varieties that, you know, Negru de Dragășan is a grape variety I really like, and there's about 25 hectares in the whole world, obviously all in Romania, but it's growing. You know, there's 3 or 4 producers, probably even half a dozen producers growing it now, because it just makes some crackingly delicious wines, you know, really drinkable, but also good quality. Then there's a white called Crampoușia, which also a Dragășan white, which can make some really interesting things. I'd love to see people doing a bit more with Grassa de Cotnar, because it can make really nice dry wines. Most of it goes into semi-sweet or sweet wines. It's the fat grape, but also known as Curva Solo in Hungary. But not many, you know, again, we've got this problem of these 2 producers who actually have quite a nice market, thank you. So the small one is making a bit of dry Grassa de Cotnar, but nobody else is really growing it. So what else?
Question there about from Vivian about Novak, am I or Novak?
Yeah. There's only one person currently doing it as a varietal wine, and that would be Prince Sturbe. And if you ask the winemaker Oliver Bauer, he says it's a real prima donna. You know, it has a ripening period of about, you know, 6 hours when it's at optimum ripeness. I may be exaggerating slightly to make a point, but it's even trickier than Pinot Noir in the vineyards. So 1 or 2 people using it in blends. It's Saperavi is one of its parents, and Negru Vartos is the other parent. So because it's so tricky to grow, I suspect we won't see that expanding in the way that Negru probably will.
And Negru and Kovac, where are they growing? I mean, which part is Romania is? And you're talking about 25 hectares of one and even less of the other.
Yes, well, Negru de Dragășan obviously comes from the Dragășan region, and it was created at the research station in Dragășan. But Philip Cox has planted some over at Recaș, and Vitis Metamorphosis, which is the Antinori project in Delul Mare, they've got some as well. And, you know, it's done. Yeah, that's a lovely wine as well. So, yeah.
Marcus wanted to say a few words about Aligote. What is it doing there?
Yes, okay. So, did you have a specific question on Aligote? Hang on, let me stop the share and I can see the messages, right? Right.
Yes. You know, I was asking about what's the why is it there? Yeah. Simple as that.
Yeah, well, it came in the late 19th century because there was a chap called Constantine Mimi, who was the last governor of Bessarabia, that he loved Aligote, and he also founded the Castel Mimi winery in Moldova, but he loved Aligote, so he was the one that brought it from Burgundy and planted it. And I guess probably it was quite useful for spirits, and probably it was quite useful because it's mostly in the sort of Black Sea region. So probably it was quite useful for keeping good acidity in that warm region as well. But there's not many producers paying it much attention. There are 1 or 2, but not many. But there's still quite a lot of it planted.
Okay, do you want to move to Moldova maybe, because we covered a little bit, we touched on Bulgaria and Romania. We will come back to the countries. We're traveling back and forth, if you notice, but we
answer Lisa, I think, quickly. The basis of the PDOs is It's a combination of terroir driven and based on sort of historic and administrative areas, I think would be fair to say. Right. So I'm going to touch Moldova.
Yeah, just to give you some kind of idea, Moldova currently has 4% of its area, total area, covered with vineyard, which is staggering. 10%, I thought 10% of the population works in wine is impressive, but just before the session started, Caroline told me that in 2006 it was 25% of the population. So 1 person in 4 works in the wine industry. It's a wine country,
yeah,
literally.
I mean, literally. Okay, so this is Moldova with its 3 PGI regions that have been identified and agreed and supported by EU money to help them develop their quality. Moldovans like to think their country looks like a bunch of grapes. They feel that the grapevine is absolutely central to their identity. And they have various legends about storks carrying a bunch of grapes over castle walls to feed their brave defenders against the Turks and all sorts of things. I suspect you have to have had a bottle or 2 too many to get that, but anyway, that's the point. So Moldova, when I first went there in 2006, probably was the single most dependent country in the world on wine, and there's a good chance it's up there as well still. So about 70,000 hectares of vineyard under noble grapes, and that has fallen a bit because when I went in 2006, I went to do a project for the USAID to try and look at the wine industry and help them bring it up to kind of international standards. And just finish these, I'll finish that tale in a sec. So they're working on a vineyard register. It's only about halfway through at the moment. Harvest volume, you could see wine production there. Again, like Romania, slightly biased towards whites. But unlike Romania, this is a country that exports most of its wine. And it's still worth 7% of all Moldova's exports. Now, back in 2006, wine was actually worth 28% of Moldova's exports. It was its 2nd biggest export earner after expat workers. And at that point, about 1/4 of the population were involved in wine in some form or another. However, when I first went in 2006, these were some of the scenes that were greeting me. And it was an industry that at that point was exporting 99% of its wines, and most of that was going to Russia. And it was going on the basis of being cheap. So quality didn't matter at that point. It was some of the worst winemaking I'd seen in my life. So to go from there to where it is today has been dramatic. And I'll just show you one picture that's from a winery called Salcuța, which is this on the right. The horizontal enamel tanks were what were being used. And of course, on the left, stainless steel, state-of-the-art winemaking. And interestingly, they were one of the first wineries that actually in Moldova that really grasped that they needed to have their own vineyards and they needed to control the quality of their fruit. So 500 hectares and their own nursery to make sure they had the right quality of plant material. So yeah, it's been a very interesting journey for Moldova from there. So in March 2006, Russia, who'd been buying basically 85% of Moldova's wines, banned the whole lot. So this was utterly devastating. $200+ million of lost to the wine industry, people basically job wineries going bust, people starving. I mean, because they were all so reliant on wine. So it was kind of, quite a shocking time to be there. But it was also quite timely that the industry needed to start reinventing itself. And it needed to not rely on the easy mark of shipping train loads to Russia, but actually to start to work on quality and improve what they were doing to to have a broader range of markets. So actually some of the vineyards have fallen out of production, but what's left is, again, very dynamic industry, because there was the first ban in 2006, then by 2009 some wines could go back to Russia, and then the Russians banned all Moldovan wine again in 2013. So by this time most wineries, I think a lot of wineries are thinking, we've got to do something different. So, and then one of the projects that I was very happy to be involved in was actually helping them to get rid of the burden of bureaucracy that stopped small producers. Because it was thousands of pages of ridiculous rules that meant it was practically impossible to start a new winery until 2011. So there's been this huge evolution since then, and even now, every time I turn around, there's a new winery popping up and new wine styles, and Moldovans are trying to develop very strongly their local grape varieties. So this is what they grow, and this is only what's known from the vineyards that have been registered. So as I said, at least half the vineyards haven't made it onto the register yet. But oh look, Cabernet Sauvignon Merlot Aligoté, which arrived with Constantin Mimi. Sauvignon does well. Ricacitelli, obviously, a lot, and Saperavi, some of the Georgian grapes that made it all over the Soviet Union. Saperavi is cracking in Moldova. Some really good quality Saperavis there. So both alone and in blends, worth noting. But there's also, hidden in this other noble grapes, what's happening is some of them they're rediscovering, and in some of their local grapes like Viorica, like Alb de Onicam, Rara Neagra, which is Romania's Babesca Neagra, but that definitely as a grape performs its best in Moldova. And of course it's a key you get it as a varietal wine, but it's a key often in blends like Negru de Pucar and so on. Fatasca Neagra, which probably came from somewhere in the Moldovan hills, which side of the border we don't know. And same story with Fatasca Alba, so quite a lot of development there. Fatasca Regala is definitely Romanian, but grown both sides of the border. So it's a very dynamic scene again recently in Moldova, and that little 17% of domestic market is actually really important to Moldova, because you kind of need your local population to be proud of your wines and to be prepared to pay for a bit more money for some of the interesting things to support the industry. And that's where you go if you're going to be a tourist in Moldova. They've done a lot of work on developing wine tourism and so on. So there's this historic village you can go and visit at Old Orhei. So anyway, so any questions?
So that's a wine, part of a wine estate, like agriturismo, or?
No, but it's quite close to. There's a winery not far away in Orhei itself. Chateau Vartelli is quite close by, so you can go and visit this old village. And there's it's like a not a cathedral. It's an underground church carved into the cliff that you can go and visit. And there's a nice restaurant, and you can try all the local Moldovan food and so on close by.
So, judging by the numbers, I think the international grapes are reliable, seems to be the dominant force, and obviously there's a heritage, but it's tiny. So, is that something that they still trying to make up their mind in Moldova? What to rely on Cabernet or to rely on Fatasca Negra?
Well, it's a bit of both, and there's always a bit of a dilemma for these countries, because what you get in the domestic market is domestic consumers want international grape varieties because they're the glamorous ones, and they're the ones that are not the rubbish that their parents and grandparents used to drink. So kind of for the domestic market, reinventing local grape varieties that they have poor memories of, because, granddad used to make a few buckets of it in the back garden, is actually harder than selling people a nice, bright, modern Sauvignon or Cabernet. So you've got this dilemma of both, whereas international markets are always asking about the local grape varieties. Even so, what you will see exported from these countries is Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet. I mean, have a look at brands like iHeart. Some of that, quite a lot of that's been coming from Moldova, and it's been Pinot Gris and Sauvignon, because they can do it really well. You know, it's fresh, modern, and it's really good value for money. So, but what
I'm
I'd love
thinking
to
about,
see,
yes, no, I'm just thinking about the way the indigenous grapes in countries like Greece, Croatia, Hungary, we just talked about Romania and Bulgaria. Again, the penny dropped that these are the heritage grapes. These are the unique selling point of a country. Do you think that is something that is, because I think with Bulgaria and Romania, they kind of understood it, and they have the volume and a variety of regions to maybe develop on that and to expand on that. But in Moldova, do you think it's yet to be understood?
I think producers are understanding it, which is why suddenly, you know, from Viorica being a grape I'd not heard of probably 6 or 7 years ago, now everybody's making a Viorica. Everybody's doing, you know, doing things with local grape varieties, because they know those are the things that are going to get them interest. They're the things that open doors. They're the things that, you know, when buyers and sommeliers are looking for the next story, it's the local grape varieties that have a sense of place and a sense of heritage that are the ones that are going to get attention.
Let me pick on Viorica. Tell us a little bit of Viorica, because I doubt, anybody heard of Viorica? Please tell us. Yeah.
Well, I think there is one in the UK, because the Wine Society had one briefly. And I'm even going to have to remind myself of the parentage of it. Okay, so it was a local grape developed in 1969, and it's a crossing of Sabel 13666 and Aleatico. So that tells you a lot about it, doesn't it?
Did you say Liatico or Aliatico?
Aleatico.
Oh, yeah.
But what it is it's kind of lightly grapey. It's quite aromatic. And it has really nice fresh acidity. And I think that was one of the things that was attractive about it at the time. And I think it's also quite disease resistant. So, you know, when you're talking about developing organic, developing more sustainable viticulture, then, you know, thinking about it's also quite winter cold resistant, which is quite important in Moldova as well. So, but thinking about these things that are maybe not pure vinifera, that have a bit more disease resistance, because Sabel is not pure vinifera, Viorica is not pure vinifera, but I think it's enough to be noble. But so I think we're going to see quite a bit more of these kind of ideas developing, and just trying to find their heritage and find something that's not shared with Romania as well, because Romania definitely doesn't have Viorica.
We have quite a few questions now, so if you just relevant to what we were just talking about now, so if we want to maybe go back to the main chat.
Yeah, okay.
There we go. So yeah, so we have quite a few from Philip, and John Kokona asks, what is the highest denomination for wines in Romania and Moldova, in a way like a DOC? If you can just touch on that.
So it's the highest denomination. I mean, Delul Mare would be the region that most people would say is, you know, sort of the Côte d'Or of Romania, though it's quite different in terms of its climate. But, you know, that's the image, is that the Delul Mare would be regarded as the top DOC by many people in in Romania. Moldova doesn't have any PDOs. It only has 3 PGIs. But I would say that, you know, if and when it does have PDOs, and I know they're under development, that Pucar is going to be probably one of the earliest, likely to be one of the earliest regions, I should think. And then possibly, you know, the Cahul region, I would think, would be another likely one. But that's still watch this space.
Philip wanted to ask about the another grape. Just let me see if I can bring it back.
Yeah, I can see that. Yes, I've never tasted it, Philip. I need to arrange to taste it at some point. Okay, so yeah. So I think there's quite a lot of that going on. There's quite a lot of grapes in the Black Sea grape catalogue that are Moldovan but aren't grown commercially. So it'd be interesting to explore. There's a question about Moldovan exports, and
Tatiana,
yes. China is actually a very strong export destination for Moldova, and I do have the data. I haven't put them on my screen, but I actually have it somewhere. So yeah, if you want the data, I can arrange to get that to you. But
how is that developed? Because again, how old is this market for Moldova, and what is the not reason, but how did they carve themselves a nice way into China?
Yeah, well, Wine of Moldova, I think, has put quite a lot of effort into promoting and going to wine fairs and so on in China. And they're probably, of all these 3 countries, Wine of Moldova has been much more effective in terms of presenting a united front and, you know, marketing the industry than, you know, Bulgaria also, you know, really struggles at the moment to promote a unit, but Moldova's done a good job. And then I should think price has got something to do with it. The fact that Moldova offers good value prices, though actually the average price into China is higher than the average price into its other sort of other big volume markets like Russia and Poland, and I think Czech Republic's quite a big market. Romania is a very big market for Moldova at the moment, and that's growing strongly. And probably quite a lot more premium Moldovan wines going into Romania than anywhere else, but also some cheap stuff too.
And yes, the Lucas Playford asking about bureaucracy in the Soviet times, and has that lessened now?
Yes, I mean, you know, people that are there will be able to explain probably, but yeah, it has lessened. Smaller producers can export. Not very many of them are, because it's quite, you know, it's still, Moldova's still very much in the too difficult box for most people, especially bottled wines. But there are brave specialists out there that are bringing, like Moldovan wines, who are bringing in some wines, but it's still stuck with this, you know, it's the place where you go and buy cheap Pinot Gris and Sauvignon, rather than people really exploring the interesting small producers. And there are some cracking good ones. You know, I did a really good tasting in Romania last November, where I did top reds from Romania against top reds from Moldova. And Moldova very much held its own. So, you know, the quality is there.
There's a healthy competition, I sense there.
Yeah, yes. Well, you know, Romanians kind of see Moldova as kind of a bit part of the family, you know, so not as foreign as anybody else. They kind of see them as brothers in arms to some extent, though obviously there have been disagreements along the way as well.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say there's a couple of questions on Bulgaria, so we possibly should move on and have a quick look at Bulgaria as well, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me just try and answer those questions on Bulgaria a little bit by going to, right. Okay, so Bulgaria. There are basically 2 PGIs in Bulgaria. The whole north of the country is the Danube Plain or the Danubian Plain, And the whole south of the country, all the way across from the Black Sea to the Macedonian border, is the Thracian lowlands, sometimes called the Thracian Valley. So this map itself came from the National Vine and Wine Chamber. So even they don't clearly think that there are different regions. And the industry strategy is that there will be 5 regions going forward. But these 2 PGIs, you know, you can imagine the Struma Valley over in the southwest corner is a very different climate to, you know, Burgos and Pomorie on the Black Sea coast. So the PGIs don't reflect, you know, they were a political decision based on wineries wanting to be able to source from wherever, rather than actually reflecting the terroir on the ground. The PDO story is that there are something like 52 or 53 PDOs, but it's less than 1% of production, because actually there are, the rules are so difficult. One winery, he said to me, you know, we'd love to do a PDO wine, but actually the PDO specifies the vine spacings. So, you know, and our vineyards are already planted, so we can't make PDO wine. So there's a little bit from Mirolio around Nova Zagora that's PDO, and 1 or 2 wines from around Schumann and Cancrum and Preslav, but that's it. You know, so PDOs in Bulgaria, sadly, are not currently fit for purpose. So I think the next step will be recognising, you know, a decent number of regions that actually reflect climatic differences. And we'll see when that happens.
Any dominant styles in because I know historically that the Danubian plains were as one half, the northern half of the country, and the south was a different one. And is there a significance to the regions, the 2 general regions, to grape varieties, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, generally people would say that the north is for lighter reds and for whites, and the south is for the big, rich reds. But actually reds dominate in all the regions apart from the northern Black Sea area. But actually the harvest is about half and half. So as you can see from the numbers here, the official registered vineyard area is nearly 65,000 hectares, but last year's harvest, 2018, the area harvested for wine was less than 30,000 hectares. And that is...
What happens with the rest?
Homemade wine, abandoned, just still registered as vineyards so that they possibly could be used as vineyards in the future or sold as vineyard land, but not producing a commercial harvest one way or another. So yeah, commercial wine production just over 1 million hectolitres, slightly below 1 million for 2019. But interestingly, the number of registered wineries has just gone up to 282. And because of that, it's a really, really dynamic place. And partly, I suppose, because there are just these 2 PGIs, and actually quite a lot of the wines are often even table wine. There's so much freedom at the moment that people are producing, you know, anything you can think of, you can find it in Bulgaria at the moment, and good examples of. So what Bulgaria is famous for in most people's minds is Cabernet and maybe Merlot. And if you look at, and there's still a lot of that shipped, exported, you know, bottom shelf, euro a bottle kind of supermarket wines. But the interesting bit is all the other stuff that's going on, the Quevri wines, the pet nats, the rosés, the different blends. So if anybody looks, yeah, exactly, and so on and so on.
So you'd say that it's out of the 3, probably the most artisanal, shall we say, or maverick operations that you can find in Bulgaria?
It might be at the moment, to be honest.
Because it was, as you said in your book, Bulgaria was very exciting. I remember the end of the 80s, beginning of 90s, and you thought, wow, this is going to burst into our life with a lot of, but then it disappeared. you could still find them, of course, but it's all this promise has kind of vanished like a train into a tunnel. And then
Yeah.
now I see when we were talking earlier about the numbers and how half the country's vineyards have been disappeared or abandoned from 2009 to these days. It's quite I quite understand. So, and again, in joining the EU and creating all these 50 odd PDOs that nobody is using, it's the confusion just is bound to create opportunities for a lot of small operations. Let's hear about the grapes. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Well. And again, there's a question therefore about, you know, local grapes, the whole sense of place thing, you know, what can be the flagship? What should be the flagship? Probably Mavrud would be the leading contender, which is a very old grape variety from around the Plovdiv area, but you can find it in most parts of Bulgaria now. But there are some people that argue that Rubin, which was a cross of Nebbiolo and Syrah created in 1944. There are some wineries that argue that Rubin actually has more potential than Mavrud. But, you know, there are good examples of both of those out there. Melnik 55 is an interesting one, aka early Melnik. But it only makes really good wine in the Struma Valley. And anyone who's tried to grow it anywhere else, and I'm talking here about, you know, a couple of really good producers that know what they're doing, like Eduardo Marolio and Corton Winery, they've said they can't get it to produce the quality. And it makes nice rosé for them, but they can't make quality red wine out of it. So Melnik 55 looks like it's confined to the Struma Valley.
It's just to orientate again people, Struma Valley, southwest of the country.
This is the in the southwest corner.
It's not far away from the Greek Macedonian side of the
Macedonia down, yeah.
And
so then I should mention its parent, Shiroka Melnish Galoza, the broadleaf vine of Melnik. You know, and people like, you know, Philip Harmangiev of Damianitsa said to me one day, I spent 7 years of my life struggling with this grape. And Petr Drozansky from Logodash has kind of said similar and ended up making really good, really nice sparkling wines with it, because it's high acid, really hard to get the tannins ripe, so it can be pretty austere, but so it makes some cracking sparkling wines and rosés and things. And it's useful in blends as well for structure and complexity. I think you were tasting one earlier, Mosh.
Yeah, I've got it here, the Orbelus, which is I think equal Rubin and broad, but that's a broadleaf Melnik according to the back label.
Yeah, that's the shoe.
So the difference between the two, just if you can highlight what's the Melnik 55 and broadleaf?
Yeah, Melnik 55 is a cross with Valdigue, and it ripens 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and you get and the tannins are kind of more supple and fruity, and actually do get properly ripe. So I'll just quickly show you what Melnik looks like as a place in a region. It is so dramatic. These sand pyramids and the little red roof town of Melnik down in the valley below them. And it's like, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours from Sofia. So it's really not difficult to get there. And then, you know, this beautiful view, autumn colours. That's Mavrud actually in the middle there, and Melnik on one side or the other. This is actually Villa Melnik's vineyard. And this winery here is Orbelus, who's one of the few actually certified organic producers. So that's where your bottle of wine came from. And they're in Melnik as well, quite close to where this vineyard is, just to show you. So were there some other questions before I show you?
I think I'm just trying to find because you share the screen, so you're limiting my control here.
I've unshared the screen, right? So.
No, it's fine. It's what we want. But I think Dimitar, you wanted to say something? you asked me to let you hold on a second. Now you can talk.
Hi, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I don't want to steal the show. I just wanted to mention a couple of words about Bulgaria. As Caroline already mentioned, there is I wrote it in the chat. There are so many experiments in Bulgaria going on right now, wine experiments and projects. Not only the Kvevri, not only the pet nuts, but there are some very promising orange wines coming around from a few wineries. To mention a few, Rusidi has an orange wine from Gewürztraminer, which was mentioned in the Amber Revolution book as well, and it's so exciting as mentioned already from Caroline. It's such a exciting times in Bulgaria right now.
Can I just sorry for the but give us a little bit of background. What's your background?
I'm I'm a ex-corporate wine buyer, currently owner of the ApolloWine.com, one of the leading online wine shops selecting Bulgarian wines. I'm an international wine judge. We're judging together with Caroline for many years in Decanter. And I'm very much involved in, I live in Sofia. I'm very much involved in the wine trade, wine business, in the wine everyday wine things in Bulgaria.
It sounds a very dynamic market, definitely, and very exciting. Not saying that Moldova and Romania aren't, but it sounds like there is a little bit more a spirit of experimentation and exploration in Bulgaria. And thank you for your contribution. I just Caroline, back to you before I ask about ways to market, but if you wanted to, there's another question about the Bulgarian Cabernet, if it's still keeping its fame.
Yes, well, there's still a lot of it, but it's mostly, interestingly, most of the premium wines now, premium reds, I would say, tend to be blends, often with Cabernet in the blend, but it's actually quite hard to find premium straight Cabernet Sauvignon now, and there are actually some really good ones. So it's almost a shame that it's kind of less famous than maybe it ought to be, but, you know, we'll see. The problem being that, you know, it's associated in many people's minds with what we used to drink in the 80s and 90s. So it's a mixed picture there. Right.
Another question from...
Okay, yes. Yeah, also a very interesting question. There's one or two really good Gamsas have come out recently. Again, in terms of the domestic market, I think it suffers from, because it's a very pale coloured grape variety. It's almost a dark rosé, but it can just make these really delicious, elegant wines that are great for going with food. And I think there was a phase where people were trying really hard to make Kadaka into a dark, structured wine, and it doesn't really work. But there are some markets in the UK and UK sommeliers, I think people like, if Eric's still there, would probably comment on this, that these sort of more acid-driven, lighter, less oaky reds are the ones that sommeliers want, that go with food rather than dominating it.
Excellent. Well, Kathy, you definitely would have won the best question contest tonight with your question, but unfortunately you can't win the wine. So here I revealed now that we are giving, because you're in South Africa, and there's no way we'll send you 2 bottles of wine to South Africa. Maybe. But anyway, Caroline is asking, what is the ambition of these countries? What niche do they want to carve out for themselves in the world of wine? Or put it another way, are there any countries they want to emulate?
Well, Moldova's been taking a lot of advice from the likes of Austria and certainly some of the Californian marketing bodies, because Moldova is very poor, and for the Moldovan wine industry needs exports. I mean, developing the domestic market is important, but so it's such a poor country, exports are actually really critical. So they do have to, so they're certainly learning from countries that have done it before. New Zealand also, I know they've been talking to. Romania, I think it's more of a, comes rather than being a national strategy, because there are actually several bodies that represent the industry. You know, the big players really want to hang on to the domestic market. The small players probably want a share of the domestic, you know, wine bars, HoReCa end, but also would probably quite like to export as well. So it's quite a personal thing. And Bulgaria as well, it's kind of stuck between these two stools of, it exports quite a lot of wine, but mostly cheap wine. But many of the smaller producers would actually love to see their wines exported, and they're only really being exported through specialists like the Old Cellar and like Vascovino. So, yeah.
So, well, I wanted to ask about a pan regional kind of cooperation for export, but I think you already answered that there's a lot of difficulty even on a national level to find a strategy and to represent the industry. But I think there's a bit of cooperation or solidarity between these countries. But do you think there is a place for maybe pan-Eastern European, shall we call it, body to represent these wines?
Well, it's certainly something I'd love to do more of. I mean, they did sign an agreement for a Balkan wine network last October, though I don't think a huge amount has been done with that yet, sort of bringing together the Western Balkan wine countries. But yeah, I think it's the only way that we're going to get buyers and the gatekeepers to pay more attention to these countries, is to kind of put some of them together if we can. I know I've talked to one or two people like Audrey from Malux and the guys from the Old Cellar and Dimitar as well, about trying to do something that, you know, we've had a couple of successful Modern Wines of Bulgaria events. How do we get people to pay more attention and to give us the time? Maybe we have to bring in some of the other countries as well and do something jointly. But I think it'll have to be maybe done by somebody who's a bit more neutral, like, you know, somebody that can not get stuck in the middle of the politics, shall we say. Yeah. Black Sea
Philip
body.
is saying about the Black Sea, yeah.
Again, that could be interesting, but Balkans, Black Sea, obviously there's going to be some overlap, and it'll depend really who's organising it and how effective they are. You need a kind of Willy Klinger character, maybe, who can really coordinate everybody. But yeah, I agree with you, Vivian. Lots of consumer interest. Whenever I do a tasting for people, they really want to know what's going on. They want to discover these countries. You know, it's the exotic East. It's not the Eastern Bloc. It's the exotic East that's the last undiscovered bit of the wine world.
Yes, I think sometimes people need to stick a pin in the middle of in Central Europe and turn the map over and see if looking at Eastern Europe on the left side, i.e. the West, change the perspective. We all, especially if we grew up in the time where everything was behind the Iron Curtain, we have some kind of automatic reaction to, well, I can't explore it because it's unexplorable unless you go there physically and you travel to these countries and you see for yourself. No matter how many books or the internet, you still think it's difficult to approach. So exotic East is definitely you need to trademark that. But it's I know you're very passionate about the neighboring countries. Maybe give us 5 minutes. Or maybe more, a review about what else in the area is exciting you.
Oh, well, Slovenia is always exciting. I mean, it's such an exciting wine country, so beautiful, and really, you know, they're quite organised and well-established terroir differences, some great producers. Croatia is so fascinating. It's such a big country. You know, you go from the sort of Malvazirs and Terans of Istria to the Babiches and Plavats of the, you know, stony coast, and then Graševina's inland, and Forment actually has Pushipel up near the Slovenian border, some cracking wines. Armenia is an amazing country, again, gone from being a former Soviet republic via, you know, designated brandy country to completely rediscovering itself in the last 10 years, really, literally. But some really fascinating ancient history and unique grape varieties. Hungary, obviously, another favourite country of mine. Obviously, everybody's heard of Tokaj. Tokaj is such a dynamic place with the new era of dry wines. North Macedonia, again, they're a really interesting country, very dynamic about organising themselves. They've got a good sort of Wines of Macedonia organisation that, because again, they've got themselves stuck with a reputation of bulk wine. And most of the producers now want to show people that they can produce good bottled wine. A lot of focus on Vranats particularly, which does really well. There, so yeah, North Macedonia, very I think we'll see more of them because they're quite dynamic and organised, and they're one of the drivers behind this Balkan wine network thing.
Serbia?
I've forgotten. Yeah, Serbia. I mean, there's some really cracking wine coming out of Serbia, but it's, you know, it's in the too hard box for most people, but there's some amazingly good wines being made, some brilliant terroirs. So some of the vineyards are stunning. Again, just rediscovering some of their ancient grape varieties, reinventing Prokopats, which fits into that niche of it can make really elegant wines when it's well made, but it was a workhorse grape in the past. So that's really interesting country. Obviously Montenegro with its, you know, Vranats and so on. Small country though, I mean, and dominated by the one big producer. Who have I forgotten? Kosovo, obviously, and then of course Czech Republic and Slovakia. There's some really fantastic stuff happening there, but we probably don't see very much of that because we're, you know, they drink way more than they produce. But Edita can comment on that if she's still here.
Yes, there were quite a few comments about other highlights.
Yeah, so yeah,
Mikel was writing about the Bordeaux blends of northern Serbia and Slovakia, Czech Republic you mentioned, but I wanted to maybe hear if it's if the three that are established, which we covered now, the three countries, acting as the big sisters or the leading. I know that they still have a lot to form themselves, but are they acting as a regional guiding sign for the rest, or is it something that is they don't see it as their role at all?
I don't think they see it as their role. Probably, I think they're too.
So we have a lot to wait before long time to wait before we see these exciting wines from the countries you mentioned. Not Slovenia and Croatia and maybe obviously Hungary, but I'm talking Northern Macedonia. You mentioned Kosovo. I don't know how easy it is to see Kosovan wine in the UK market or in any market. But it's
not at all. And Serbia's, I think that Roland Wines, I think has got Oscar Mara's wine from Serbia, but there's pretty much nothing else from Serbia in the UK. So some of these wines are really difficult to get hold of. But I would love to, you know, we've got some specialist importers who are getting passionate about these countries, you know, the sponsors of this program, and there's say one or two other specialist importers who are bringing in some of these things. So I just encourage everybody to go exploring, you know, go and spend, you know, taste some of these things. Some of you are drinking some really nice wines, I have to say.
Yes, last chance to ask Caroline a question, guys, before I wrap it up and tell you who won what. but just so I will wait another few seconds. It's I think we covered, obviously, it's difficult to, it's not a lecture where you cover a country thoroughly and we move on to the next country. It's a dynamic conversation. We obviously left a lot of stuff that people might think needs to be discussed behind. We're not trying to solve these countries' wine export issues or try to come up with radical ideas. It's an open discussion, and I think one last question from Philip. Caroline, what is the reason you are the only voice talking about these wines? That's a very good question.
I don't know. I mean, partly because I've been lucky enough to have been able to be involved for kind of nearly 30 years. And I've also had an awful lot of support from friends and from producers in those countries who have, you know, helped get me access to tasting the wine so I can learn about the industries. But I don't know, really. But I don't know why I'm the only voice, because it's an amazing place and I really want to spread the word that there's so much going on.